Grandmaster's History Project of the Most Worshipful Grand Lodge of Free and Accepted Masons of Washington. My name is Very Worshipful Bud Cook, and I will be the interviewer. My audio video operator is Most Worshipful Brother G. Santi Lascano. And we are honored to be here with Most Worshipful Brother Warren J. Bud Gilbert Jr., our Grand Master in the year 1985 and 1986. Most Worshipful, first allow me to thank you for taking part in this history project. It's very important to us. The first question is, Most Worshipful, what prompted you to become a Mason?
Well, my father had been active in Masonry, and I knew that right from the time I was a grade school boy. And so it was natural that when I approached my 21st birthday, he asked me if I was interested, and I said sure, because I knew somehow, some way, that it meant a lot to him. And his father had been a Mason, and when he came back from France, his father suggested he join the Masons, and so I had every reason to want to be, as an only son, to do what my dad did.
Yeah. Seems we both have the nickname of Bud, and I asked you what it was. That was an interesting story. How did you get the nickname of Bud?
Well, my mother was born and raised in Anacortes, and when she went to the university, her father was born in 1840 and could hardly did any schooling in, and was a self-made man, so he knew very little about university and college life because he only went to 1.5 years of school. But he certainly did and fulfilled his Scottish heritage, and he wanted his children, his two daughters, to go to school. So my mother's older sister went to Whitworth when it was in Tacoma. And then he must have heard about the University of Washington being adequate and being state-supported, so he sent my mother down. And she ultimately wound up in a sorority, and one of her sorority sisters had a son who was going to be, her husband's name was Burke, and he was going to be named after his father, and they called him Buddy Burke. And my mother didn't want me with some other nickname, and my dad agreed, and I was given the nickname of Bud or Buddy while I was still in swaddling clothes in the hospital. I've been Buddy ever since, particularly with girls. I've always encouraged girls to call me Buddy.
Yeah, I started as Buddy, but shortened it when I was a teenager to Bud. It's a good nickname. Most Worshipful, how did you come by the design of your Grandmaster's pen?
Well, they hadn't had a pin before, and we had Tommy Rutledge had been a deputy, and he was a ball of fire in the Seattle area. I think he was a deputy either 4 or 5. And he, among other things, he sold pins and things like that, a set of little knickknacks and accessories. And he was going to be one of my committee chairmen. I don't remember just what. And I think he suggested we have a pin. I said, hey, that's a good idea. And I said, I know already what I would want. He said, what's that? He says, can you make me one? Get the manufacturer, and it came from the Asian area. And I'd like one that's a profile of the state of Washington, the geographical location. And then in one corner, put the state it isn't the flower, it ought to be, the nice rhododendron, and then the other small corner, opposite end to the side, put a little square compasses so they'll know that it's a Masonic pin. And I think I got 5,000 of them, and I sold them for $1 a piece at we had 31 district meetings, and everywhere I went, I had this pin, and I'd say, gosh, if you will buy one of these, this will help put on a public school dinner. And we sold almost somewhere between 400 and 4,500 of these pins at $1 a piece. And so that was one of the ways we funded what was one of my 2 initiatives during the year. And that's how we came by the pin.
It's interesting. What was the theme for your year as Grandmaster?
Well, the things I wanted to stress, Bud, were 2 things. The public schools were kind of a religion in my family. My father was the first working class man who could go down to the state university, and it was only because he started work on mail sacks at 8 years of age, and he was able to have a journeyman's card as a telegrapher by the time he finished high school, and then he went on through high school, college, law school, and as far as he was concerned, he lived the American dream, and it was only possible because of the public school education. And you might just as well criticize the priest as to criticize the school teacher in the house that I was raised. My dad would not tolerate criticism of a school teacher. He says that every one of them is there to teach, and if you don't want to learn, that's all right, but don't complain about the school teacher, because they all want to teach if you show them any interest. And boy, did I hear that once. I can go word for word. I heard it 500 times. I had an older sister, and poor thing, she didn't stop him. She would come home moaning about a school teacher. And my dad, I had to pick him off this roof when that happened. So I'm like that. I wound up being a trustee of the university. The oldest boy of mine is past master of my lodge, is a judge now, and he's done other things that I'm proud of. But the two things I'm most proud of my son, other than marrying to the right girl, is he's a great father. I really think he's wonderful as a father. And secondly, he was a wonderful chairman of the school board during some tough times here in Mount Vernon. And because of the kind of a kid he was a wonderful lightning rod for the superintendents. They had two of them during his period. And by consensus, he won a tough race as district for the judgeship. And the only reason he did it, in my view, is because the school people in the county knew he had been a really, really good school board member. And so my family, and I'm just one of the family, public education is still wholly in my family. And so I wanted to stress that we had a very active program in the state, and I wanted to emphasize that above all else. And so when I might as well tell you this now, when I was elected junior grand warden, in the fall of the year, I ran into, happened to be at a meeting with Most Worshipful Bill Miller. When I was grand orator in 1970-71 for Brother Deming, right next to me is the grand lecturer, and it's none other than Bill Miller. And we became friends then. And even then, it didn't take you long to know this man was really competent. And he'd been chairman of the finance committee, he'd been grand marshal, he'd been, I think, grand lecturer, and he had started to kind of back out. And I said, I want you to be my first appointment, Bill, because sooner or later I'm going to be grand master, and I want you to be my grand marshal. And he said, I've already done that for Jim Wood. I says, that's okay. I was active in Boy Scouts, and what we did was we picked the best man to be scoutmaster, and we didn't let him say no. And I don't want you to tell me no, because you're going to be my first and most important appointment. And he says, well, under those conditions, I'll do it. And then I said, really the most important thing I want to do is I want to stress public schools. Who do you recommend? And he says, well, there's a past deputy, past master up in Issaquah. And his name's Wally Tonstead. And I know Wally because by name, and I met him once, because my deputy, the year I was master in '62, was a really, really top man, Fred Ovenell, and he was on the committee, and he raved about Wally Tonstead. So I already knew the name, and I knew that he'd done such a good job, and he'd done it about 8 years, and he'd retired because he was married late in life, and he became principal of the school. And he says, so I called him, and he told me, I'm not going to really do it, I'm too busy. And then I told him the same thing. I said to Miller, I says, I can't let you say no. You're the man, this is the one thing I want to have done. And he turned out to be an exceptional chairman. And and I'll tell you later about what he did, but he was so good that after our second grand secretary, who I talked into serving one more year before he retired, he'd gone through 3 assistant grand secretaries. didn't want to have any of them succeeding. And he spotted the good job that Wally done, and we'd had this wonderful luncheon lined up for Grand Lodge for the winners of schoolship in each of the 31 districts. And so he said, you know, what would you think if I appointed Wally Tonstead as a part-time assistant grand secretary while he was still chairman of your committee? And I said, well, only on one condition. What's that? He says, that you're going to support him for grand secretary. He says, well, that's kind of what I had in mind. And I can tell you, I just thought the world of Wally, and he was a wonderful grand secretary. And I was chairman of the jurisprudence committee for 12 years, and we had various things come up. And I never wavered in my appreciation for the dedication to masonry and the depth and breadth of knowledge of the craft that Right Worshipful Brother Walberg Tonstead. He was a wonderful, wonderful Grand Lodge officer.
I got to meet him. He was a member of King Solomon in Auburn for a while. Got to know him that way, not that well. The stories that you mentioned definitely related to me. They're important to the history of this Grand Lodge.
Well, when I got him, he was serving only as secretary of the lodge in Issaquah.
Most worshipful, what were some major goals that you wanted to pursue during your term?
Well, the overall overarching approach, what came from my years as a Boy Scout master. I'd been an Eagle Scout, and when I came back from law school, we had a little fledgling troop in my church. I'm a Presbyterian, and they weren't going to do anything. It had been going for about 6 weeks, and it was sputtering. And somebody found out I had been a Boy Scout. And they asked me to do it, and I decided that the only way I could ever repay scouting as a boy for what I'd gotten out of it, the fabulous experience I'd had. I was born to be a Boy Scout. I just loved to camp and loved to hike and everything about it. And so I said, well, this is one way I can pay back the people who gave me my Boy Scouting career. So I took over the Boy Scouts, and I learned that the proper way to have a scout troop is to train the scout leaders. So I would have a green bar meeting, and I'd train, I know they could be the only ones, and the senior patrol leader, and one thing led to another. And then, so we'd go to these camporees and things, and my team, my troop just did phenomenally well, both in the Skagit district and the overall Mount Baker Council. And at one time we sent 13 kids down to the Nationals camp at Camp Philmont in New Mexico, 250,000 acres. It just everything. I had wonderful support from the parents, and I just learned the basics of just kind of turning it over. And if you do the basic outlines, your troop committee will be tickled to do what they need to do, transportation and all that stuff. And once a month we'd have a court of honor. They'd come, and I could get one to make a speech or this or that. And I had the support of the adults and the support. And I frankly have to tell you that the reason I did as well a job, if I did any job at all as Grand Master, I learned it out of Boy Scouts. It sounds a little simplistic, but it's true. I had 14 boys become Eagle Scouts, one of whom got the highest award Yale University gives a graduate. So I had fabulous boys.
That's impressive. As I mentioned to you before, I was a neighborhood commissioner for Boy Scouts. You train the adult leaders to train the boys themselves, and that's how you get ahead. Most worshipful, what are your favorite memories as a Grand Master?
Well, anyway, let me complete. I'd forgotten my point.
Okay.
That's the background. So I had 3 2-day at the sufferance of the wonderful, wonderful support I got from my immediate predecessor, Most Worshipful Brother Matt Martin was so kind, and he said, I'll be out of the state in September, October for 2 days, so I could collect the 114, 120 that I was going to appoint deputies and the various things, line officers. And we got together. Nobody knew what their jobs were going to do, and we had a wonderful thing to talk about what we ought to be, and I wanted them to have a purchase on what the program was, which was going to be primarily charity, public schools. And then I had, in the spring, I had everybody primarily except the deputies. And then I had a third one for the deputies, but always with the senior officers. And then in the fall, again, the committee chairman and the deputies. And my approach was that the deputies were to be the grand master in each of their things. And so they should train the lodge officers in the lodges in their deputy and in their district, and if they had a question on jurisprudence, or they wanted support on getting a speaker, or there was a weakness here or a weakness there, don't go beyond your deputy. Go to and create the fact that the deputy is your liaison to the Grand Lodge, and he's your local guy, and he can help. And we get masonry through the deputies into the lodges. And that was what I wanted to project, that we want, all of us should support the deputies from the top end and from the bottom end. And that was the overall arching approach I had to being the master. And I had done that when I was the deputy. So I was, if anything worked well, it was because it built a sense of camaraderie and collegiality among the officers, because the deputies really were important. Mm-hmm. And so the two things we wanted to stress were, as I indicated, the public schools. And so in each lodge, in each district, so to speak, we would have the district pick from the nominees from the different lodges, a boy and a girl, to represent the district at Grand Lodge. That was, so if here at Mount Baker, we would go to the high school and we'd have the teachers and come up with, in our case, 3 boys and 3 girls at the end of their junior year to be honored. And then the deputy and the masters of his district would select out of this pool of winners a boy and a girl, and they would come to Grand Lodge. In the middle of the day banquet would be a public school appreciation. We even flew the person down from Southeast Alaska, 1 parent and 1 boy, 1 parent and 1 girl for each of the 31 districts to come to Grand Lodge at our expense. And that's one of the ways why we needed to sell these pins to help finance this.
Yeah, sell the pins.
And that turned out to be very rewarding. I asked the great Bill Miller, okay, I need a speaker. Who should I get? And he said, well, what do you got in mind? I said, well, I don't want to get Senator Jackson or any of those things. I said, I want somebody who has reference to scholarships, schools, and ambition and things like that. And he says, well, how about somebody from Boeing? I says, well, what's better than Boeing? It's the biggest company, and it's a success, and it's wonderful. Can you get somebody? He says, well, let me see what I can do. So he came back and he says, what I would like to recommend is that Boeing usually promotes within the company. And by the time they're 45 and before they're 50, there's usually 2 executive vice presidents, and everybody knows that one of the 2 of them is going to be the CEO. And we've got a fellow named Phil Condon, who is an engineer, very capable, and except for the fact he's been divorced, the Boeing company probably would find that not to be ideal, but that otherwise he would get it automatically. But I still think he'll probably get it. And lo and behold, I had called Phil Condon, I wrote him, and I don't think I went to see him, but I talked to him, and I talked to his secretary, and explained what the Masons were, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and had all these outstanding children. He says, I think I can do that for you. And Grand Lodge was at SeaTac, so he said, fine, I'll do that for you. And later on, he became CEO of the Boeing company, and he made a wonderful talk, and he went out and he introduced himself one by one in the crowd, before he spoke and after he spoke, and it was a thrill to have this genuinely impressive human being speak to these kids. And some of them could say, well, maybe if I really work, I could be like him someday.
Yeah.
It was wonderful, role model. And charity was a little bit the same. We had a fellow who was later my Grand Master George Leslie, and he was chairman of the Library and Museum Committee for about 5 years. And his job is with junior colleges was to be the librarian. And he had a lot of purchase on that. He thought a lot of developing the museum and the library and building archives in the Grand Lodge. And I came to him and said, you know, George, I want you to be the chairman of charity. I don't want to do that. And I said, well, I don't. He says, I want to continue my work. I don't think anybody else, and on and on and on. And I said, well, I want to tell you something. If this is going to be a killy cure, a good expression my dad had, it'll either kill you or cure you. I'm not going to appoint you chairman of the Library and Museum Committee. I'm going to get new blood, new people in there. So let's have that over with. Secondly, you should be Grand Master someday. You've got all the qualities, and you're never going to be Grand Master if you're just chairman of the Library and Museum Committee. I'm going to stress charity with the public schools all year long. That's what we're going to do. And I want you to be the head end of the boom. And under that condition, I want you to say yes. And I wasn't mincing words with him. And he said, okay, bud, I'll do it. Well, we did. We had money in the charity fund. So I said, first thing we're going to do is we're going to give $100 to every one of the districts. And we're going to challenge each district in their own way to raise as much money as they can with this as seed money. And I think we raised $28,000 or something like that total. And George Leslie got all the credit because he did a good job. He was a capable man.
Yeah,
and in 3 years' time, he was elected junior grand warden.
Yeah.
Just as I figured, because he had all the qualities that we need for leadership.
I met him when he had the first Wardens Conference in Tacoma.
Well, he was very able. So those are the two things I stressed in the year, was the charity and the public schools, and then the overarching thing of having the deputies be central to the life of all of the, and not, because later on I'm chairman of the Jurisprudence Committee, and I'd get phone calls from different parts of the state and various people. And I said, I think I know what district you're from. And then he'd be surprised I knew where he was from and what district. And I said, you know, we got a deputy there. In an ideal world, you'd pose this to him, and if he has a question, let him call me.
Most worshipful, what are your favorite memories as a Grand Master?
I remember, I'm a widower, and hardly now a day, I married the only woman I ever loved. I never told another, I went out with a lot of girls, I never told another girl I loved her. And I never knew her to be unpleasant and all these qualities. I was extremely fortunate. I got to do a lot of things. And I worked hard. We raised these kids, and all of them stayed out of jail, fortunately, I guess. And so there's hardly an hour goes by, I don't think, it was 2 years ago, August 1st, about something Marilyn and I did. And you'd be surprised. Here it is, 26, 27 years later. And I can remember, I think constantly about the time I was down in Ilwaco or down in Pomeroy. I can remember being a fabulous dinner at Enumclaw, and the Eastern Star came in with 3 different types of homemade pies. And I made an absolute fool of myself with that. And then we had a bluegrass band down at Little Falls Lodge, and I went down to speak at a 75-year reunion, and there isn't a bend in the road that I haven't been to that I don't have these wonderful memories. And so the best part of being Grand Master, I remember I joined Caribou Lodge number 4 up in Barkerville. And it's a job with a blind tiler, if you know. They lift the ladder up. And so you're in on the second floor and the ladder comes up. And so the thing is just packed with people. And I was junior grand warden late in August of that particular year, 82. So they call on everybody, and you got no more than 50 seconds to talk. That's it. That was the edict from the East. A very worthwhile edict, I'll tell you another one. So anyway, I got up and I said, I'll tell you, I don't know how far it is from Mount Vernon to Barkerville, except it's 5 times through the first degree lecture and 7 times through the charge. And I was practicing it because that year I was going to be conferring the degree and giving the lecture all the years. I represented the beauty of youth. And then fast forward, I went to the conference on Grand Masters, both my Deputy Grand Master and my Grand Master year. And we had a fellow, we would get the 50-second rule. Now there's about 75 Deputy Grand Masters, and we're all puffed up as we can be, thinking we're very important. So we're told we got 50 seconds to say whatever we want to say. Well, there's one fellow gets up, he says, my name is Bob Singer, and I am the Deputy Grand Master of the great state of New York. And he said, and if the muggers don't get you, the nursing homes will. And that's all he said. I remember that all my life. If the muggers don't get you, the nursing homes will.
I could tell by how your face lit up that you had
Anyway,
great memories.
So anyway, I guess the most is that of the wonderful, wonderful people, and I think it's the finish of Lodge. How should Masons meet? How act and how part? And we all part on the level. And if I were the president of the Masonic world, I would say, as soon as you go out of office, you take all the trappings away and everybody's brother. There's none of this most worshipful, right worshipful, very worshipful. I think that we ought to all, because that has been my experience in Masonry. The people I most enjoyed were just, no matter how well educated they were or how this or that. One time I was in Anacortes, and they had this fabulous fellow who was the Grand Master. He came from Saanich, and he was the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge in British Columbia. And so his Grand Marshals were there. And so he says, well, I want to introduce my Grand Marshal. And so he says, one time we're at such and such a meeting, and you know how they give the grand honors. And it's 9 times for the Grand Master, 7 times for the deputies, and then on down. So, so the grand honors up in Vancouver. And he said, well, he says, we were at this thing, and we got up to 7 or 8, and I could hear him mumble to me. Gosh, he says, there's no 9s in the decimal system, Grand Master. Says to me in the middle of giving grand honors for someone. Well, you can't help but remember these wonderful memories of these people, and everyone that I most had fun with were the ones who were just common as dirt. Didn't matter how much money they made or what they did, but the ones who were just regular, ordinary, good Masons who lived as much as they could by the simplicity which we try to preach for everybody.
Yeah, those were excellent memories. Most worshipful, does the man make the office, or the office make the man?
I can't answer that. In the best of all possible worlds, we come as best prepared we can. We all come from a different background. And we're unique. And if you follow the Boy Scouts, you try to be as prepared as you can be and give it your best shot, and no two are the same. So I think that it's like anything, if you put a lot into it. As I indicated, I was an Eagle Scout, and I had a fabulous time. I've said many, many times, I learned 20 times as much in Boy Scouts as a Scoutmaster than I did as a Boy Scout. And I learned more in Masonry, in being a leader, and trying to create a Masonic experience for people, and then when I was trying to learn it for myself. And it's a humbling experience to be Grand Master, because people expect you to do something.
Right.
And you don't want to be anybody else, but you want to be the best you can be.
Yeah, you're taking my next question away from me. What is it really like being Grand Master?
Great fun. I said as junior grand, I think the best job in the universe is junior grand warden, because you don't have to do a damn thing. You go to all these meetings, and all you got to do is respond to a message of welcome, and then you have no other responsibilities except to say hello to people. And so that I was only in just, but no, the whole experience was just, I never would have dreamed it.
Yeah, it's obvious. Well, first of all, who was the greatest help to you as Grand Master?
Mind you, in a varying degrees, was well acquainted. I was acquainted, not just transitorily, with almost every Grand Master from Frank Fulton forward, and he was in the 1950s. I was in Grand Lodge in 1960 when Al Bradford was elected. I happened to serve on the jurisprudence committee with him all 12 years I was on this committee. We wound up being absolute best of friends, hunted together, played golf together over the long. And over all those years, certainly the top 5, and I'd have fingers left over, would be Wayne Joseph Deming. Unbelievable Grand Master. Just, he epitomized and still does everything that's good about Masonry.
There stands living Masonry.
He's just a wonderful, wonderful human being. And my dad had a great expression: don't give me a sermon, show me one. Wayne Deming shows you a sermon. The way he conducts his life, all of a sudden, out of the clear blue, he'll say something or do something, and you say, why didn't I think of that? He'll go over and he'll talk to some lady, or he'll do this, or he'll bring something up. He's amazingly acute for 94, and I had the great privilege of being his grand orator. And so I went all over the state with him. And so anyway, and then as a result, I got to know 5 Grand Masters who had been deputies for him. And so anyway, he was, and then the others, I would say, of course, I've already said Bill Miller. I just, as the years go on, I'm more and more amazed at the capacity of this man. And then I would say, in a passive sense, Matt Martin, because he supported me when I was doing my organizing with my Deputy Grand Master year. He was fully supportive of me. And then my 2 wardens that year, Jefferson Edwards was right behind me, and then Mark Ewing right behind him, both enormously qualified and very witty, charming fellows, and their insight in helping me select the people out of the 300 names I took to the meeting. And we used to run the Masonic home at that time. And we would meet in the morning on Saturday, and then we would disperse, except the 3 of us would stay all afternoon for at least 6 months, going over the list of who should be on this. And I wanted to have half past deputies of my 14 line officers the Grand Bible Bearer, and et cetera, and appointees, and half past deputies. And then I wanted half of them from Eastern Washington and half from Western Washington. And then I wanted to have somebody from every district, minimum. And they had been around so much that they could say, well, this guy's better. And I'm always in mind of putting somebody on is for either one of two reasons. We had a dear old scout, Cougar Tremblay, who was from both North Bend and Issaquah, and nobody had ever appointed him anything. And I appointed him just a committeeman, and you'd have thought I'd made him a cardinal of the church. He was just the most wonderful, wonderful, down-to-earth fellow, and I don't know that I ever made an appointment that gave me more satisfaction than Cougar Tremblay. And that again was one of the suggestions. This fellow has worked long and hard, never had any recognition, and I wouldn't have been able to do that on my own. But if you ask other people, and I think I probably got that out of Marks, because Marks was a deputy in 6.
Yeah, I got to know him fairly well, but you mentioning that those people are the foundation stones of our fraternity.
Well, he, of course, came out of 13, but 6 and 13 in my time were very close to each other. There was an awful lot of interplay between the two districts.
Yeah, I'm out of 13. Most worshipful, do you come from a Masonic family?
Well, yes, my father was master the year before I was born, in 1926, and he then became very active he was active in everything. He was kind of a fellow. But he was the worshipful master of the Grand Council of York, right? And I'm trying to get something here where his speech, I'd like to give the first paragraph of his speech to the Grand Lodge when he went out of office. And mind you, this is 1940 or 41. We are prone to think that Masonry exists for its members alone. This is true only to a certain extent. Just as a church benefits the entire community in which it is located, just as schools have an influence in the lives of those who do not attend them, so the establishment of a Masonic lodge in a community means the general rising of the standard of morality in the city or town. And then he goes on to develop the past centuries. Our earth, then in the next paragraph, our earth is a graveyard in which cities and empires sleep. And it's in the second degree. G lecture, the lapse of time, the ruthless hand of ignorance, and the devastations of war have laid waste, and it goes on and on. Mm-hmm. Freemasonry, notwithstanding, still survives. It's kind of along that line. And I'm raised with that attitude in my family, and so even though there was no demolay when I was a kid, it got down to me one way or another that Masonry meant a great deal to my dad.
It's funny you mentioned the G lecture. That's one of the most beautiful, to me, one of the most beautiful part of Masonry. Explains it all.
What, the G lecture?
G lecture, yeah. It really does. Did your wife play a role in your Masonic career?
Yes, in the sense that she was totally supportive. Her father was a member of the Masonic, inactive member of the Masonic fraternity, youngest member of the Shrine in the state of Vermont when he was a boy. And so I think she could see that it was a good influence on me. And she was fully supportive of our 3 sons joining the lodge, and 2 of them were past ministers. And but for the fact of that, I might never have joined.
Yeah. You'd have a strong woman behind you, without a doubt. What important Masonic changes did you see in your career?
Well, I think that in my time, let's say not just since that I was active, I was active at the time when I took my degrees in '48. 13 of us took the proficiency at the same time. I mean, it was a huge. The 62 year I was master, we had 23 meetings, and we averaged over 50 members. Parenthetically, I was on a Grand Master's Trial Committee when I was Junior Grand Warden, and it was of a lawyer who was being charged with some kind of misfeasance. It wasn't malpractice. It wasn't mal being bad. It was just, he wasn't really competent. He'd been done his lawyering in the service, and he got discharged, and he started out in this particular town, and he wasn't doing well. And so anyway, they started a proceeding, and they, instead of doing it themselves, which they well should have done, they turned it over, and Most Worshipful William J. Stedeman, Grand Master in 1941 or 42. He was immediately after Matt Hill. And he was a wonderfully educated Englishman. And he was the chairman. And I was able to watch a really tremendous human being sift through all this, and he came down with a Solomon-type decision that only an older person who had been through the wars, had a lot of forgiveness, and could see the ultimate good of everything. And he came down and said, this is enough punishment. And we did not recommend this anything other than a brief suspension for mostly the period of time that had already transpired when he had this miserable consideration. And then I had another time, Jim Van Ice and I were down at, I was a Junior Grand Warden, I think, and we were down at Bremerton 117. And I know I was Junior Grand Warden because I was been upstanding, responding to the district deputies to address a welcome. And this fellow came up to me afterwards, and he had been State Master Counselor, later Kitsap County Prosecutor, later State Senator, and he was running for Attorney General. And my locker partner in lawsuit was by far the finest criminal defense lawyer in the state of Washington. Did nothing but that his entire career. Enormous respect in the community of Seattle. A Jewish fellow named Murray Guterson. And he represented this fellow. And there was a criminal indictment against him by the federal prosecutor. And up to the last day, they were going to allow him not to face this charge. And he did a complete reversal overnight. And I always contend it was J. Edgar Hoover who interceded in this, because he was so political that because this fellow was going to run for Attorney General, they filed against him on it, and he had denied that he was going to take any money. And if you're a native of the state long enough, we had a fellow named John J. O'Connell who was going to run for governor, and he somehow was involved in whether or not this group of people were paying for certain legislation or saying for something. And O'Connell was defeated or didn't run, and it prevented this fellow, and I've forgotten his name. And somehow it came up, and they got some informal advice, and I says, well, do you people really want him to be punished? No, we don't. His lodge. They knew that it was a vendetta. The federal attorney had been defeated for prosecutor in Kitsap County by the very man we're talking about. So they had been not only professional opponents early on, they competed for a girlfriend that wound up being the wife. And so there was a real bitterness. And my friend said, this is the worst example of prosecutorial indiscretion I've ever experienced in my entire career. Period. What this prosecutor did, this federal judge, federal attorney. So this fellow came up to me 10 years later. He did about 18 months in a softcore federal prison. He was disbarred. Later on, he was reinstated about 8 years later. But he came up to me and he says, you know, I want you to know that this is the first Masonic meeting I've come to, and I saw you were going to probably be there, and I wanted to come up and thank you because the one thing I did not want to lose, I didn't even care if I lost my bar license, I did not want to lose my Masonic membership. And what we did, I recommended to him that they just suspend him so that he automatically, without any further note, as soon as he got out of prison, he would get his membership back. And I don't know whatever became of that fellow, but he had the humility to come up to me and say that the most important thing in my life, other than my family, is not to lose. And then I later found out he was master counselor in the state of Washington at DeMolay.
Back in
And so those are part of my experiences that were just, and I learned from Bill Stedman about that. I wanted to say, if you people talk about decline, when he joined Destiny Lodge in Tacoma, you had to have a 3-year proficiency certificate to be the marshal. Every meeting, 52 meetings a year, every meeting, full tuxes, over 200, always. Can you imagine? And I said, let me repeat what I think I heard you say, is what I told him. I says, is it possible? Well, he was a fascinating guy, and he's just a soft-spoken, humble guy you ever want to meet, and he had a huge job in Washington, D.C. during the war.
Did you help others become involved in Masonry?
Well, yeah, I suppose one way or another. But the only one who really came up to me and told me was we had a young lawyer come into town, and some people just have a spark to them. And I told him, I said, what you really ought to do is go up to see the Willie. He's an ex-Marine. And I said, you're going up there, and he was just a personable kid, and you can get to, he had worked a little bit as an assistant attorney general in the labor and industries claims. And I said, you go up there, a lot of people hurt, and if you got that background, and you should be able to start right out. Go see such and such a lawyer, and he'll get you started. So he did, he worked 6 months, and he was off and going. Next thing I know, there's a chance to be, prosecutor just was gonna quit. And so they had an election coming up to fill the unfulfilled 2 years of his term. He was gonna quit right in the middle of it. So there was an appointed acting prosecutor, and he was going to run as a Republican. So I said, what's your political persuasion? He says, well, I'm really more of a Democrat than anything. I said, well, why don't you file as a Democrat? You've only been here in town for a year. It's a good way to, my dad was a prosecutor, and he did the same thing, and he only won by 87 votes, but winning's winning, and he was the prosecutor from 22 to 30. And he was a born campaigner, and I said, I think you're the same way. Why don't you file for prosecutor? So I counseled him on some of the things to do, and he gets elected. Next thing I know, he's saying, I'd kind of like to, when I get done, I'd like to run to the legislature. So he goes down to the legislature, and he's there halfway through the first term, and he's the majority leader. I says, Patrick, how in the heaven's name did you get to be the majority leader? You're as juniors, you're greener than grass. He said, I don't know. They just said, I ought to do it, and so I did it. So then he's 2 years, then it's 4 years. And the next thing I know, he's going to run for the Senate. Well, he wins that by a mile, and he goes down there, and there's a majority leader in the Senate, and there is a whip or something like the number 2 spot. There's about 29 of the 50 senators are Democrats, and so he's the number 2 in the Senate, and he's never been a senator 5 minutes. He's just the kind of a guy that people just really, really like. And then he gets, finally he's the United States Attorney. Jimmy Carter is elected, I think. Could have been Clinton. I guess it must have been Clinton. And that's 20 years ago. Yeah, it was Clinton. And Clinton, the new man wants to appoint the United States Attorney, which is a huge job in Seattle. Right now, it's Ginny Durkin, and she was number 1 in the school. Her dad was majority leader in the Senate, a huge guy, almost elected governor. Martin J. Durkin was her dad. And she's just a fabulous gal. She's going to be governor or something someday. Well, that was the jumping off spot for everybody as being United States Attorney. It's a huge job. He says, guess what? They want to make me a U.S. Attorney for the western side of the state of Washington. I says, well, if they don't want me to do it, you might as well do it. So he said, okay. He says, well, if you'll support me, I'll take it. So by golly, he wound up just before he's going to take office, they got a bad diagnosis for cancer.
Oh.
He's not even 50 years old. And I've told many people, nobody would know Maria Cantwell's name if it weren't for the fact that my boy got cancer, because he would have been the United States Senator. His name was Pat McMullen, and a wonderful boy. And he came over and he asked me to sign a petition to join United 93, and we'd be up in Cedar Woolley. I says, great, Patrick. I said, I see you want to be a Mason. You got any Masons here in your family? He says, no. And I says, well, wonderful. What did you do? What did you hear about it? Well, I just knew that you belonged, and I figured if it was good enough for you, it must be good enough for me. I want to join the Masons. What's it all about? Tell me about it.
Good enough for the
And
state.
so that's the one person I know who would say that the reason he joined the Masons was because of me.
That's good. Next last question, most worshipful. Is there anything that you want to talk about that we may not have discussed?
Yes, I've got a couple things from my biographical sketch. And I've already indicated about the huge influence of my dad, and when I knew he kept practicing the ritual work for the Elks when he was the exalted reeler. He was number 2 in that. One of the 2 or 3 most famous names in American jurisprudence when I went to law school was Roscoe Pound, 34 years dean of the great school at Harvard University. And he was also the deputy Grand Master of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And he said that, of our fraternity that the reason why Freemasonry had importance to him was just because it concerned itself with the fundamentals of life. And then he said, these are the fundamentals of life that the fraternity stood for then and does today. 1, the practice of benevolence. 2, the formation of friendships, the enjoyment of fellowship, and the importance of work and labor. And you set a little circle is not beautiful because of its size, it's because of its roundness. And that's a simple statement of what Masonry stands for, right there. Importance of making friends, enjoying friends, being benevolent, and for heaven's sakes, you got to work and cherish labor. And nothing gets done. And I repeated that many times in the year. And I sent out newsletters to all of the worshipful masters, and then I sent them to the Grand Lodge team.
Have to communicate.
And kind of thing. And I stressed the district meetings, and I think that's about it.
Most important question, most worshipful, what message would you like to send to today's Masons?
I would tell them that my deputy was Fred Ovenell from Burlington. A marvelous family, well-known family. And he said at Masonry, Bud, he said, there's some Masons get a lot out of it and others not so much. But he says, I don't know anybody that's been hurt by Masonry. And if a person's got a good foot, they've always got that foot forward in a Masonic meeting. If they're going to be clean-mouthed, or they're going to be dressed properly, or whatever it is, conduct themselves, they'll do the best job they can within their limitations in a Masonic. He says there's a lot can be said for any institution like that. And when he went to the various installations, he always would pick one little piece of the ritual of the, and then he would talk a little 3 or 4 minute talk, riffing on maybe the steward's installation or the deacons or whatever it was, or something that happened during the day. And I would say that you spend time to learn a charge, you're going to know more about Masonry than just sitting in a mini. And then when you go into the lodge, remember, you're in there with friends, and if you have worked hard, you'll never have a more forgiving audience than in a Masonic lodge. And they want you to do well, and they won't criticize you as long as you respect it by giving it your best shot. And my experience is that I can remember being marshal in '56, and so I would, chaplain allowed me to trade back and forth. I got out there, and I told my dad, I said, gosh, I said, Dad, there's no oxygen out there. You run out of air. And he said, well, Bud, he said, just hold your head up and give the prayer to the far wall and make your mistakes loud. Don't make them whispering. He says, it'll always work better. And so everybody knows you've made a mistake, you might as well make them out loud. So that would be what I would tell them. Learn the ritual, and you'll know more about it if you take the time to learn it.
That's exactly right. You don't really know the ritual until you learn it. Most worshipful, in the name of our Grand Lodge and those who are involved with this project, I wish to thank you for your participation in this video history project.
Well, you can tell.